warm welcome to the Apprenticeships for England conference. What brilliant timing, Lindsay. Brilliant timing. Once again, last time we were here in July, we were thinking about the implications of Brexit. We're still thinking about the implications of Brexit. And I think on the day we were here, we had a new Prime Minister and she was announcing her cabinet, so there was all that excitement. Now we have all the excitement of Tuesday's announcements. A lot of detail came out around levy, apprenticeships, procurement exercises. And obviously today there's a great opportunity not only to hear more detail about that, but equally importantly to hear the reflections and thoughts from people in the know in the sector who will tell us what they think. And I'm hoping that they will do just that. So, without further ado, let's crack on. And with great pleasure, I'd like to invite Bhavina Patel from the SFA to come and talk to you about where we've got to with apprenticeship standards. Thanks, Bhavina.
I'm here to talk about apprenticeship standards, the new standards that are up and running, and just to give you a bit of an overview as to where we've got to and how far we've got in terms of developing new bits and pieces in different sectors. So just to give you a quick overview, as you know, and hopefully you've read lots of stuff out there already, the new standards are employer driven, they're simple, and they're there to drive quality, with employers in the driving seat defining what skills, knowledge and behaviours are required for each particular standard. So, in terms of the different elements of this new area, what we've got is trailblazer employers coming together, minimum of 10 employers with a spread of large and small sizes, coming together to develop a particular job role and forming that into an apprenticeship, setting out what the key knowledge, skills and behaviours are. For those of you who've seen a draft standard or an assessment plan, and those published also, you will see that the 2-page standard is very short, concise, and it replaces a long SACE frameworks that we've got currently running in parallel. So each standard will have 2 pages defining what the role of the job is, the key knowledge, skills and behaviours. And what's new with the new standards is an endpoint assessment. So what we will be doing is putting apprentices through their training, they'll be developing their knowledge, skills and behaviours, and the employer group have also defined what that endpoint assessment will look like, and it can vary. Each apprenticeship assessment plan will offer things like portfolios with professional discussions, situational tests. Anything that the employees come up with will become the endpoint assessment test, which is independently carried out by an assessment organisation on the Skills Funding Agency's register. The other thing as part of that endpoint assessment is something we've asked employers to look at also is grading, and grading can be in various forms. Again, the employers will define what that looks like. So you might have a merit, distinction and a pass, or a pass and distinction. There are some exemptions to grading, which, depending on which criteria they fall into, the Minister will exempt some assessment plans to have no grades within them. All apprenticeships will be a minimum of 12 months learning, as we have now, and where there is professional registration, the employers have been asked to align that. So when an apprentice completes their apprenticeship, they automatically are able to then apply for registration, which actually works very nicely. Okay, so in terms of process, any employers that you're working with who might want to collectively come together and develop an apprenticeship standard, this is the process they would go through. It's all online. The trailblazer would submit an expression of interest stating what the job role is. We would put that out to consultation for 2 weeks, and the whole sector can make comments. It will go through an approvals process before government approves it to be approved for development. So the standard, once when the expression of interest is approved, the group will come together and develop their standard. Once that standard is developed in draft, again, it's the same process, submitted into government. It will go onto a 2-week survey portal. We'll take feedback, share that with the group. If they need to make any changes, they can do that. And then it goes through the approval process again. And similarly, the same thing for the assessment plans. So do look out for those survey portals and do provide feedback. We do actually find that really, really valuable. And then, obviously, once the assessment plan and the standard is approved for delivery, we will publish that on the gov.uk page, as we do with the standards, and we'll invite individual organisations to apply for the register to carry out endpoint assessment, and delivery commences. So to date, we've got over 1,400 businesses involved, covering over 100 sectors, and we've got 146 approved for delivery, and they're all on the gov.uk page. And we've got over 2,500 starts, and 30% of those new standards are actually in the hires and degree space, so there's a lot of interest in developing hires. Okay, so just to give you a bit of an example or two about what these look like. So here's the butchery apprenticeship, where they've got on programme, they would do the food safety, health and safety, knife skills, and including maths and English. Their endpoint assessment is a multiple choice, a practical, and a discussion, professional discussion. And they've decided actually they will have an excellent pass and fail grading. And financial services, again, they've got on the left-hand side the on-programme elements, and their endpoint assessment is a project and a professional discussion, and you can see the grading on the right. So that's a very quick kind of overview of what those look like. For those of you who haven't seen the, we call it the tick list, useful bit to carry around, particularly when talking to employers, or even employers looking at this to see what's in development. So we've created this handy list of everything that's in development and at what stage it is and at what levels they are. So you can actually see at hand very quickly what's there. As you will also know, there's a transition from frameworks to standards, so that work continues. We've had 2 rounds go through, and obviously the sector is notified when we decide to withdraw frameworks, so you've got an opportunity to start developing whatever you need to develop in order to deliver the new standards. Just a bit more about hires and degree apprenticeships. Fast growing, as I said earlier. There's a lot of standards being developed, 100 companies involved, over 100, and we've got 40 universities actually contracted now to deliver degree apprenticeships. So there's a progression route for young people there, and just some stats around what we've got so far. So those are the degree standards, just to give you a flavour of what's happening in that space. So anything from engineering to product design to teaching and management, chartered management, so quite a variety there. We've also given you a list of all the universities there that are involved, and quite a lot of them partnering up with FE colleges and training providers, I think. So in terms of what employers need to do, obviously we look at what's already on that tick list. If there's anything that's not there, to think about, should there be a standard, an apprenticeship in this area? Maybe look at, is there a current framework, and does that need to be evolved into a standard as well? And start to talk to other employers, and if they have the appetite and the voluntary time to do it, to come together to develop new standards. And in terms of what providers can do, it's exactly the same. Look at what delivery will look like. What providers will also need to think about is having detailed costing plans of what that delivery looks like, because employers will want to know, as part of their conversation about cost, what they're getting for their money. Look at what's what they need to do in terms of preparing individuals for endpoint assessment, reviewing their content for delivery where you've got something similar and updating that. Also, you will also know that the Education Training Foundation support is also providing lots of support to training providers. So do look at their website and get engaged. They've done a lot of work on there. Things like provider reference groups, webinars, workshops, etc. You won't be able to see this, but when you get the slides, hopefully you'll be able to see it on your laptops. But what we tried to do is give you an overview of, because I cover health as my sector, talk to lots of NHS trusts, etc. What I've tried to demonstrate to them is how they might potentially use their levy across the organisation. So not only have they got the clinical standards, they've got finance, HR, customer service, etc. So it's just a plot, really, what's available at what level, and the coding there is green is ready to go. Amber is where the standards are available, but the assessment plan isn't yet, and the reds are in development. So it's just to say, think of this as a workforce development piece, and see what's available and what's coming up, and think about how the levy might be used across the piece. Just again reiterating, if you want to develop new standards in this space, identify the occupation, check the checklist. What you will also find on the gov.uk page is where we have already approved somebody to develop something, there is a contact on there, so you can actually contact each group if you wanted to get involved or be part of the discussion or be added to any survey databases they have, and get together and come, present your case through an expression of interest through the portals. The portal is available every month, so submission dates is usually the last Thursday of each month, so we will be expecting more applications today. Institute of Apprenticeships, obviously you've heard that this is coming. This will be up and ready from the 1st of April. We have a shadow chair, Anthony Jenkins, and also a shadow chief exec, Peter Launer. And in terms of their role, so all of this stuff around who's going to approve these new standards going forward, it will be the Institute's role. They will approve, reject assessment plans and standards. They'll provide advice and guidance, and also determine what policy there should be around standards and how the review process will work, etc. They'll advise on funding as well, and they will have an overview of quality of standards and assessment plans. There are all the links there, so the tick list, gov.uk page, etc. So do go and have a look, and also links to the online surveys. So next week you will find on the online survey everything that's come in this month. So should you want to comment on any of those draft standards, expressions of interest, or even assessment plans, do feed that information in, which is really valuable. And that's me. So a very quick overview of standards. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Bhavina. There will be the opportunity to ask Bhavina some questions a little later. Really interesting to see how new standards are developing there, and particularly the number of higher and degree apprenticeships. I talked to quite a few large businesses, and almost without exception, they are very, very interested in this area, driven, to be honest, by a desire to spend their levy, but are seeing degree apprenticeships as a possible substitute for graduate recruitment in a number of examples. And I think it's really, really exciting that we've now got a growing number of higher and degree new standards for employers to begin to get their teeth into. So some really good stuff there. Thank you very much, Bhavina. It now gives me equally great pleasure to introduce former colleague of mine, Una Bennett, who is going to take us, I suspect, through quite a journey around what was announced earlier of this week, and probably one or two other things as well. So, Una, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay at the back. Great, thank you. As Tony's mentioned already, and you're very well aware, we had a lot of documentation published earlier this week. I'm not going to attempt to go through all of that. I am going to pick out some key things, particularly that have changed since the publication in August, and also in terms of the first presentation, to talk about some of the implementation issues that people need to think about, particularly about engaging with the digital apprenticeship service. And then I'm going to talk about the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers and the procurement exercise which is going on as well. So first of all, as I said, I'm going to cover off around the levy. So just touch on the levy itself, what you can use the funding for, depending on whether you're a levy-paying organisation or not. And then also I'm going to cover some bits about the funding changes which have happened since August. I'm going to touch on contracting because it's an area we've had quite a number of questions about. So again, just want to explain how that's expected to work in future. And then the digital apprenticeship service. I'm afraid it is going to be a bit of a whiz through, but you will have the slides afterwards, so some opportunity for you to look at that at your leisure. So in terms of the levy then, so it starts from 6th of April 2017, and it's been levied at a rate of 0.5% of pay bill paid through PAYE. So employers who are subject to the levy will be declaring that every month to HMRC. It applies to all UK employers in every sector, regardless of whether they've got an existing levy in their particular sector. Because of the allowance that works with the levy, in effect only 2% of UK employers will actually end up paying the levy. So for those people who are paying the levy, what will happen each month is as they declare that the levy that they're due to pay each month to HMRC, we in the SFA will get data from HMRC and we'll be able to display back to the employer the funds which are applicable to them in England. And as we've got here on the slide, just to explain about how effectively the English proportion is calculated. If you're an employer and all of your employees are based in England, they have their residential address in England, then 100% of the levy will appear in your digital account. If you've got some employees, perhaps because you're near the border with Scotland or Wales, who actually live in the devolved administrations, then a proportion of your pay bill related to those employees will be paid to the devolved administrations and won't appear in your digital account. But I say I guess for many people in this room, you're based in England and all of your funds will appear in your account from next May. The reason it's May rather than April is because although the levy comes into effect in April, actually you only declare the first amount due for April in May, and that's when we will get the data. So it's around the end of May, around the 20th of May, we're expecting to get the first information through. And as each monthly payment comes into your digital account, government will top that up by 10%. So you will see both the amount you've declared and the 10% coming in each month. So non-levy payers, and obviously that's 98% of employers in England, they will also be able to benefit from the funds which have been raised through the levy, but they will access the funds in a very different way. So they won't be using the digital apprenticeship service from next May. They will be able to go to training providers who've got a contract with the Skills Funding Agency to be able to deliver their apprenticeships. And I'll come on in a couple of minutes to talk about some of the funding for that. If an organisation isn't paying the levy, so the government will be paying 90% of the costs of their apprenticeship, and the employer will have to pay 10% of the costs. There are some exceptions, which again I'll come to, but it is important that everybody understands that for most employers in this category, you will have to contribute 10%, and it's 10% that has to be invoiced and collected by the training provider, and the training provider actually has to declare to the Skills Funding Agency that they have collected those funds. This co-investment, the 90%, 10%, also comes into effect when we've got a levy-paying employer who has insufficient funds in their digital account because they've already used it for apprenticeship training, or actually they haven't contributed very much to the levy at all. So in those circumstances, people can still continue to train their apprentices to the number that they want, but they will then be liable to 10% of the cost of training and assessment for those apprenticeships. So in terms of actually purchasing the training, as I've said, the funding system comes into effect from the 1st of May. So any apprenticeships which start before the 1st of May next year will still be on the existing system. And then any starts, whether that's for a levy-paying employer or a non-levy-paying employer, come in from the 1st of May. Levy-paying employers can actually then commit to apprenticeship starts from the start of May. As I said, we'll actually see the funds in the digital account later in the month, but we have provided tools already to employers so they can start to calculate how much they should expect to have in their accounts and how they could spend it on apprenticeship training. As I've said, the funds come into your account monthly, and equally you will pay for your apprenticeships monthly. And what we'll calculate the cost of the apprenticeship over the expected lifetime of the apprenticeship. And you'll see that monthly amount coming out of your account each month. There is 20% that is being held back at the end of the apprenticeship for completion, and this applies to apprenticeships that are for either levy-paying or non-levy-paying employers, and it's on completion of the apprenticeship. So for a standard, that means that the individual has actually sat the endpoint assessment or taken the endpoint assessment. Doesn't mean they've actually passed the assessment, but they do need to have completed that, and for the framework that they've completed all of the different elements of the apprenticeship. For non-levied employers, they will continue to use training providers very much in the same way that they do today. So they'll be able to approach training providers who've got a contract with the Skills Funding Agency to deliver their apprenticeships for them. And then at some time in the next couple of years, and we haven't got a date for this yet, those non-levy paying employers will also move to using the digital apprenticeship service. So I'm now going to come on to the changes that have happened since August in terms of the funding policy. As you know, government published a number of documents on the 12th of August this year. We sought consultation or feedback from employers and providers and others with an interest in the sector on whether the policy was right or not. And government has listened to that, which is why you will see some changes. So it was a genuine consultation. We wanted to understand what the issues were with the policy. And apologies, some of this may be a little difficult to see from the back of the room. One of the things that changed were employers were saying to us, particularly in the early days of this new policy, that having funds expiring from your digital account after 18 months was too short a period. So the expiry date has been set to 24 months. And what that means in practice is so that funds that will come in today will expire in 24 months if they haven't been used for apprenticeship training and assessment. And it always goes in, first in, first out in terms of the particular funds. And in terms of using the funds, we will always use the oldest funds first for apprenticeship training, which means that employers can maximise the use of their levy funds. There was quite a lot of feedback about the funding that was available for 16 to 18-year-old apprenticeships, particularly in frameworks. What had been set out in August was that there was going to be a £1,000 payment to both the training provider and the employer, and that will continue. So people welcome that, and that will continue. But also as part of transitional arrangements from moving from frameworks to standards, there will be an additional uplift to the funding band paid to the training provider for the particular framework that a 16 to 18-year-old is taking, and it also applies to 19 to 24-year-olds who have been care leavers or who've got an education, health and care plan. If you look at the information that was released on Tuesday around funding bands for frameworks, it sets out the funding bands for the individual frameworks and the additional payments which are applicable, both for the £1,000 that's available, but also the uplift that is available for those particular frameworks. We also had quite a lot of feedback about the removal of disadvantage uplift. So this is an extra amount that we paid in the current system for frameworks, and we have then listened to that feedback, and there are some additional payments going to be available as it says, part of the transitional arrangements for frameworks, depending on which area of the country that an individual is living in, and it's based on the postcode, and there are tapered amounts depending on the level of disadvantage in the individual's postcode. And what we'll be doing over the next year is looking at what we should be doing on a longer term basis with that. So in terms of funding bands then for frameworks, so we've allocated each framework to the nearest funding band based on the current funding that we're providing for that particular framework based on the adult rate. But as I've said, we've got some adjustments to recognise the additional costs of training 16 to 18-year-olds. So as I said, this 20% transition funding band additional payment for the training provider and also for 19 to 24-year-olds who are care leavers of the education and health care plan. We had already announced in August that for STEM frameworks, so science, technology, engineering and mathematics, that we would uplift the framework bands, and that has continued. So again, in the information that was released on Tuesday, those uplifts have been built into the bands that you've seen. So you will see that STEM frameworks are proportionately more generously funded than some other frameworks. And we've got the payments that will be paid for apprentices that are in disadvantaged area. And again, these payments will go to the training provider rather than the employer. So there's an additional £600 for training an apprentice in the top 10% of deprived areas, £300 for the next 10% and £200 for the next 7%. But again, please do look at the documentation, and you certainly training providers will be able to work out what that would mean for them and their particular business. So in terms of funding bands for standards, standards are generally more generously funded than frameworks. That recognises that they are generally bigger training programmes, there's more content in them, and obviously they've been designed by employers to make sure that an individual is fully competent in the particular occupation. So that's been recognised in the funding bands that have been set. As with frameworks, every standard has been allocated to a funding band, and if you look at the information again that was released on Tuesday, you'll see the funding bands which are available in this funding year up to the 1st of May, and then the funding band which will apply from the 1st of May. And those funding bands again apply whether the individual is working for a levied or a non-levy paying employer. There are 15 funding bands, and the funding bands set the maximum price that either the individual employer who's paying the levy can use from the digital funds, or the maximum price which government will co-invest towards. In other words, put their 90% of contribution towards. There's no lower price or lower piece of the band. It's up to the individual employer and provider to work out what's the optimum price to deliver the quality of programme that you need in your particular business. And obviously that would vary depending on the number of apprentices taking a particular programme. In terms of how we've allocated the funding bands for standards, we've looked at the information we already hold, which includes information on the cost of starts where we've already got those, but also from information that's been supplied by trailblazer groups. And as we go through and apply standard funding bands for standards as they come on stream each month, we will be looking at the information we have got from the trailblazer groups to apply funding bands for those new standards. So other additional support, which I haven't already spoken about. So one of the things that is in the piece in the middle here is for smaller employers. So if an employer has fewer than 50 employees and they're recruiting a 16 to 18-year-old or a 19 to 24-year-old that's a care leaver or with an education, health and care plan, actually they're not going to have to contribute their 10% of co-investment towards the cost of the apprenticeship. So we recognise that these employers recruit actually quite a lot of 16 to 18-year-old apprentices in particular, and government's very keen that those employers are not put off getting involved with training those individual apprentices. So for those employers, effectively, government is fully funding their apprentices. In addition, they will also be able to have the £1,000 payment for taking on a 16 to 18-year-old. And this is recognising that there are additional costs for supervising and supporting younger people in the workplace, and their training provider will be able to have the £1,000 payment as well. One thing we have been asked, if an employer is also the training provider, will they get both payments? And yes, if you're an employer provider, you will be able to get both payments for an eligible 16 to 18-year-old or 19 to 24-year-old. We will continue to pay additional learning support. So this is for individual apprentices who need more assistance with their actual learning. They've got a disability, dyslexia, whatever it might be, and that will be drawn down in the same way that it is now. So it's not funding that comes out of the employer's digital account if they're paying the levy, and the provider will be able to claim for the amount that the individual actually needs. Again, English and maths, and this again was published in August. We will continue to fund that, again, not from the employer's digital account. This is from separate government funding, and we'll pay for the English and maths that the individual needs up to level 2. If the individual needs to do a higher level of maths, for example, because the apprenticeship actually demands that, then that would need to come out of the funding band for the particular apprenticeship. Okay. So some other things in terms of the funding rules, and again this was announced in August. So in terms of cross-border fundings, this is where you might have apprentices who actually are working for you in England but are domiciled elsewhere. As long as you, as the employer, can say at the beginning of the apprenticeship that this apprentice is expected to spend 50% of their time working on their apprenticeship in England, you can draw down funding from the English system to fund them as an apprentice. So it is slightly different to the way that the English proportion is calculated in terms of the levy, but this was the optimum way that came out from employer consultation as to how best it should work in practice. So as I say, for every apprentice we will be collecting a declaration around that from the employer. In terms of prior qualifications, one of the things that employers said to us was really important was to loosen some of the previous rules that there were around the level of qualification that an individual had. So individuals can be funded where they're obviously taking an apprenticeship which is at a higher level than they currently have, but also at the same or a lower level where they're moving into a new role where they require substantial new training. So as an employer and a provider, you'll need to look together at whether effectively you can meet that test. And it's about, does it fit the normal rules around an apprenticeship, so at least 12 months with 20% off the job training. But it does give employers much more flexibility, for example, to retrain staff who may have come out of school or education quite some years ago. One of the other issues that employers have asked us about, particularly those who are paying large amounts of levy, was about transferring funds to other employers, either in their sector or in their supply chain. We're not going to be able to introduce that for the start of the new system in May. but we have now committed to introducing this in 2018. We're about to start some work with employer groups to look at how we can do this. And obviously one of the things we need to make sure is that it isn't disadvantaging smaller employers versus larger employers, and that we can manage compliance risks within the system. So we expect to see further information on this in 2017. So contracts. When a levy-paying employer, or any employer actually, is looking for somebody to provide their apprenticeships, they will need to negotiate the cost. If they're a levy-paying employer, then they will also need to have a contract in place with the training provider, because effectively they're saying, I want you to use funds which are in my digital account to pay for my apprentices. So the employer and the provider will need to have a contract in place to recognise that. Government isn't specifying what that contract should look like. We are saying there's some things you should have within the contract, and that we will ask you to declare that, but what form it takes is entirely up to the two parties. The negotiated price for the apprenticeship will need to include the cost of endpoint assessment. Now, I realise that's going to be difficult in some cases because there aren't enough endpoint assessors in place just at the moment, although the numbers are growing month on month. But you will need to make an allowance at the start of the apprenticeship to recognise the cost of endpoint assessment. And then at the stage where the individual is taking the endpoint assessment, it'll be for the training provider to pass on the cost to the endpoint assessor organisation on behalf of the employer. So in terms of contracting, and this does look quite complicated, but in fact it isn't, I can assure you. So what we've got here is, so employer A, so up on the left-hand side, has worked with the provider, this blob in the middle here, to agree to deliver their particular apprenticeship programme. And between those two organisations, they will need to have a contract for service in place, because actually the provider is giving them a service in terms of delivering their particular apprenticeships. The Skills Funding Agency will also have an agreement with the employer, and that's so that we can effectively release the digital funds to pay the provider for the apprenticeship. And it's also to set out what are the rules that those funds can be used for. So it's in terms of what is eligible costs within the particular apprenticeship. So we will ask the employer to sign up to those. It'll be a digital contract in terms of the digital service. And then the Skills Funding Agency will also have an agreement with the training provider. And that sets out things that if you're a training provider, you'd be very familiar with. So returning data to us monthly, so we can make sure that the training provider can be paid and can check with information that we've had from the employer, and to be subject to Ofsted and exact those sorts of arrangements which are currently in place. So there will be one of those in place between the Skills Funding Agency and the provider, but we will then recognise that then they may be then supporting a number of different employers, not just the first one, but several other employers. So there's only one provider funding agreement in place. The provider themselves may then have a subcontractor which has been agreed with the employer, and they will need to have an agreement in place with the subcontractor, and they will also then need to have an agreement in place to pay the endpoint assessment organisation at the time that becomes payable. So hopefully that explains it a little bit. You probably will make more sense when you can look at this in your pack later. So for employers that don't pay the levy, it's slightly different. So in this instance, there's no agreement between the Skills Funding Agency and the employer. The Skills Funding Agency will have a contract of service with the training provider, and there will need to be some agreement in place between the employer and the provider to pay the 10% co-investment. And equally, as in the previous slide, the provider may have a subcontractor, and again they would have a contract with the subcontractor and to pay the endpoint assessor at the time that becomes payable. Right, I'm now going to very quickly take you through some bits about the digital apprenticeship service, and apologies, I know there's a lot of information here, but I assume that you probably want a little bit more rather than a little bit less. This is very much looking at it from an employer perspective. So what we've got within the digital apprenticeship service, there are a number of different steps. So one is about planning the apprenticeship programme. This is live already, and I would encourage any employer or provider in the room to have a look at this. It's called Estimate My Apprenticeship Funding, and it allows an employer to work out how much levy they're going to pay and will be available in England for their apprenticeships. So what the employer will do is enter their UK payroll, put in what percentage they estimate of employees are there in England, and then they start then to choose the sorts of apprenticeships they might want to deliver with the funds from their digital account. And then what you get, and this is for an employer who doesn't have enough money in their digital account to pay for their apprenticeship training, what it's showing here is the estimated funds coming into the account each month, the 10% top up, and it's included in that. The cost of the training for the apprenticeships that the employer has chosen, and then in this case, because there wasn't enough funding in the digital account, what the government will pay for the remaining balance for the cost of the training, and what the employer will have to pay for their 10%. And it's there, you can play around with it to your heart's content, put in whatever apprenticeships you want. It has been updated with the latest information that was supplied this week, so people can be looking now about what training programmes they could put in place from next May. We've also got choosing apprenticeship training and assessment. This is also now live. The data we're using in the system at the moment has got all of the current information on current apprenticeship frameworks and standards, and for providers who've currently got a contract with the Skills Funding Agency for apprenticeship training. As we go through the Register of Apprenticeship Training Provider process, then we will update this tool with the training providers who are successful through that process. But at this minute, it's only those people who've got current contracts with the SFA. What the tool does, it enables you to look for an apprenticeship that might be suitable for your particular business. And this is all about making sure that employers are informed consumers of apprenticeships, and they can have a good dialogue with the training provider. We do expect them to work still very closely with training providers. And then you can drill into any of the individual apprenticeships to get a summary information of the particular apprenticeship, and if it's a standard, to look at both the description of the standard and the assessment plan. And that helps the employer to see, is it the right apprenticeship for their particular organisation. Then once you've chosen the particular apprenticeship you're interested in, you can then search for a training provider that has got the capability to actually provide this particular apprenticeship that you're interested in. You can search on locality. You've got some information there about the quality of the training provider. But at that point, as an employer, we would expect you to pick up the phone and talk to the providers to decide which is the right one for your particular organisation. In terms of then recruit an apprentice, again, this is live already. If you're a training provider involved in providing training for apprentices, you'll have seen this. So it's available at the moment for providers to post apprenticeship vacancies on behalf of employers. We are looking at when we can roll out this functionality for employers, but not likely at this stage, I think, before May next year. We've improved the site over the next few months, so it'll help providers on an employer's behalf to track the applications that they're getting in, and then also to be able to provide feedback to individuals who are applying for apprentices. In the digital account itself, so what I've shown you earlier is sort of the estimator tool, but this is what I'm showing you now are the current versions from the prototype we've got, which we're testing with employers at the moment, as to how it will look like when an individual employer has funds coming into their digital account. So you need to set up an account in the same way as you may do for lots of other websites, so username and password. And then one of the things that you will then need to have to be able to access the digital funds is access to a government gateway ID. So people involved with your payroll currently will have this information. What you'll need to think about now is who's going to manage this account for you if you're paying the levy from next April, and who do you want to have access to this information. If they want to have access, they will need to have the government gateway ID that's associated with the PAYE schemes you want to access. For some employers, you will have multiple PAYE schemes, and what you can choose to do is set up one digital account to manage all of the PAYE schemes, or separate ones if that suits your particular organisation, because you've got different divisions, for example. And what is shown here is the functionality to allow somebody to actually select the different PAYE schemes. This is just showing you the overview of the different functions we've got available around the funding. You can drill down into the number of apprentices you've got and see where they are on programme, and the contracts you've got available. Sorry, I am whizzing through this, but I'm a little bit short of time here. But this is actually what the account will look in practice. So what I've shown you earlier was the estimator tool. This is what it's likely to look at when you've actually got real funds going into your account. So showing payments going out to the different training providers that the employer is working with, as well as the digital funds coming into the account. And again, it'll be quite important, obviously, for you to keep on top of that and to look forward to see where your funding is going, and the estimator tool will help you to do that so that you can make maximum use of your digital funds. There's also some basic information available on apprentices as well. That's why you need to think quite carefully about who's appropriate to see all of this information, both the funding information and some basic information about the apprentices on programme as well. And then starting a contract, as I've explained earlier, so the employer and the provider will have an offline contract. We don't see that contract, but the employer will need to declare to us that they have a contract in place with the training provider, and they will do this through the digital apprenticeship service. So what they will do is, and this is showing it as if it's a number of different apprenticeships, you'll be able to upload the information either one at a time if that suits you, or to do a bulk upload, and you can choose whether it's the employer or the training provider that puts in the information. What we will need is a declaration from the employer that that information is correct. And it gives some information about the number of apprenticeships on the particular programme, the type of apprenticeships that they've got, and the price that's been agreed between the two parties. And then we use that then to pay the training provider each month. Okay, so I've whizzed through that. In terms of where we're going next, so a lot of the stuff you already had published earlier this week. So all of this information has now been published in October. In December, there will be more guidance available from HMRC, so of particular interest to levy payers to understand exactly what they're going to have to do each month on declaring the levy. And then in January next year, we'll have the digital apprenticeship service available for employers to register, to be able to set up the accounts, which I showed earlier. Obviously, you don't need to do that at this particular point, but you may want people to be familiar with the service. Then we've got National Apprenticeship Week in March, which is obviously an important part of the calendar. And then the levy starts to be paid from April. The digital apprenticeship service goes live in May, and that's at the stage where a levy-paying employer can make commitments under the new system. And then we expect by 2020 that all employers will move across to the digital apprenticeship service, but as I said, we haven't got the exact date on that.